Hello everybody, this is Dr. Novak. Boy, do I have a good video for you. It's a question that's always asked, and as my videos go on, you're going to learn more and more and more about microbiology, and you're going to be quite surprised at some of the information I'm going to be giving you. Something you're not going to see a lot of. In this video, we're going to talk about essential elements. And these elements aren't told to you. Now, when I came up with the Anoxic Filtration System 30 plus years ago, we didn't have things like substrates that had iron in it and everything else. It wasn't until my research was done and I started coming out with a lot of information that all of a sudden manufacturers started coming out with products that had iron and stuff in it. Otherwise they didn't really exist. Or they start coming out with products that were made from clay and baked. All of a sudden, is it a coincidence that all of a sudden manufacturers changed over? Or is it serendipity? It was kind of funny, it was right after all my research that they start coming out with different things. Whatever. Before this video, I thought, hey, I'm going to ask you a question. Try to answer it. You may know the answer, but let's see if you know. We have what is called elements. And these elements, there are 18 of them, which are elements that are needed for bacteria growth and plant growth. Okay, but there is one element, that is very soluble, and it is the most important element essential to bacteria growth and aquatic plants. This one element, I'll repeat that, it is the most soluble of all the elements and is the number one most important element for bacteria and plants. What is it? We'll be getting right to the answer in this video, so stay tuned. Hello everybody. For those of you who are new to my channel, this is the tank that I set up quite a while ago. It's a 90-gallon. If you're looking at the substrate being so deep, it really isn't. It's 3 inches deep, but there's an extra inch of on the bottom as the plenum. Otherwise, it's about 3 inches deep, and this is the anoxic filter, as you would call it, and it is a plenum, and is a slow-moving plenum, and the very back is a 3/8 bubbler. And so people like to see an update. This is an update of it. Tank has been changing as time goes on, but that's to be expected. So anyhow, let's get on with the video. In aerobic organisms, oxygen is used as a thermal electron acceptor during respiration. This is largely because oxygen has a very low reduction potential, allowing aerobic organisms to use their electron transport system most efficiently. In aerobic organisms, thermal electron acceptors other than oxygen are used. These inorganic compounds have a higher reduction potential compared to oxygen, meaning that respiration is less efficient in these organisms, generally leading to slower growth rates compared to aerobes. Many facultative anaerobes can use either oxygen or alternative thermal electron acceptors like nitrates for respiration, depending on the environmental conditions. Most respirating anaerobes are heterotrophs, although some do live autotrophically. With that understood, what most hobbyists are not aware of is that adequate supply of essential trace elements that are required for nitrifying bacteria to grow, which include facultative anaerobic heterotrophs. These same trace elements are used in laboratories for culturing these organisms. A supply of trace elements should be included with every package of nitrifying cultures that you buy. One of the examples is Sure Start. That came with a package of trace elements. The reason trace elements are added is because bacteria especially use a lot of trace elements when they are essentially growing to reproduce in our aquariums and in our ponds. So a lot of manufacturers don't give this, but I think Sure Start was one of them that did actually give trace elements. Since trace minerals tend to precipitate out of solution with time, and inadequate quantities of these critical nutrients can occur, we therefore incorporate laterite in every biosinosis clarification basket and in your plenum. This is the reason I say to add laterite. Not only have scientists found out that these essential trace elements play a significant role in establishing a new filter, which would be your biological filter, okay, but in its continuous maintenance, these trace elements are very important. Okay, they aid in the production of cells to take care of essential organics and inorganic compounds to keep them broken down, and they carry on their means of doing what they're supposed to. Understanding the role of these elements in the aquarium environment is important to the hobbyist, for these types of additives such as laterite are needed to maintain a healthy aquatic environment for all bacteria. Laterite carries many of the essential trace elements that are needed for bacterial growth, such as kaolin, ferric oxide, ferric hydroxide, iron, non-organic trace elements, magnesium, cobalt, zinc, and copper, just to name a few. Of the 18 essential elements as shown in Table 1, only 9 are essential trace elements. The other 9 essential elements, along with trace elements boron, iodine, and potassium, are available in all systems at a nutritional level much higher than what any organism requires. There are always far more of these elements present in a biotope such as our ponds and aquariums, for that matter, than what is required for life to flourish. None of these elements need to be added to provide ideal nutrient levels for our aquarium inhabitants. There is some valid scientific debate whether any element, such as tungsten, are essential for bacteria and our aquatic life. If any additional elements are found to be essential, they too are required in such small amounts that they do not have to be added. The remaining 6 essential elements, on the other hand, do need to be added on a regular basis to provide for the nutritional requirements of plants, algae, fungi, bacteria, and animals we keep. The 6 elements which need to be added include cobalt, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum is one of them, and zinc. These essential trace elements must be in soluble form. Insoluble elements are of no use to any life form. These essential elements are found in the food we add to our aquariums, but often not in significant quantities for all the aquarium inhabitants. However, they are in sufficient quantities if you use laterite as an additive to the substrate or to a BCB basket. Most of the essential trace elements in our aquariums are found with insoluble precipitates. Very little of these elements are ever released back into solution. Of the 6 essential elements, iron is the most soluble, also the most essential to bacteria and aquatic plant life. That was the question I asked you. It's iron. Believe it or not, iron is the most essential element for bacteria. I think I've explained that in other videos. And plant life. Believe it or not, it's iron. That is the most soluble of all elements and the most essential element to help bacteria reproduction. In a natural body of water with billions of gallons available from which to draw, an adequate supply of these elements is available. In a closed system like our aquariums, it is a completely different story. In an aquarium, there is much less water available where the trace elements can be stored. There is a much higher ratio between substrate and water volume. Only kitty litter with laterite provides a readily available source of carbonates and other compounds which facilitate trace element precipitation in insoluble forms. Laterite works same way in the tropics of South America and Africa. In our aquariums, there is almost a much greater biomass competing for these elements than in natural bodies of water. The use of various filtration materials and equipment has also been blamed for trace element removal. So what I found out is that filter that you use as a canister filter, that hang on the back filter, these are filters that actually use up these elements that we are looking for. That is the reason I have always recommended to use like laterite in your BCB basket, or to use laterite in a plenum, is because it keeps providing these elements on a continuous basis, which are essential elements for bacteria growth and your plant growth. When a new pond or filter or aquarium for that matter is first started, there is an enormous increase in the population of beneficial bacteria. The heterotrophic bacteria, which reproduce very rapidly, quickly exhaust the very limited supply of essential trace elements present. When nitrosomatists are introduced into a new aquarium or filter, their growth is enhanced if these elements are also added. Without the addition of the 6 essential trace elements, delaying and establishing the nitrifying bacteria portion of a biological filter can occur. The research that was done on these elements, plus iron, is the reason all of a sudden you saw manufacturers start switching their train of thought on substrates. And all of a sudden, magically, you could see substrates that were made from clay and substrates that had iron added to the substrate. All because of the research that was done to prove this. And magically, these substrates all of a sudden came out. Where years ago, substrates were basically just rocks and stones, pebbles. As we know, today a lot of hobbies have changed that thought, literally changed it to substrates that are silica based, such as sands. They've changed in other ways to actually hinder bacteria growth instead of aiding bacteria growth. And this would explain why long-term probability of providing for the cells that live in a substrate or in your canister filters, hang on the back filters, why they eventually may not grow as much as they did in the very beginning. And this definitely explains why aquariums in time can start failing. When this failure occurs and you wind up having more organic matter than you do, in other words, you have more food stuff available and you don't have enough bacteria to consume that food stuff, what happens? You have algae outbreaks, you have cyanobacteria outbreaks, you had the depletion of your water quality, and this is where you have the collapse, if you want to call it that, or demise of the aquarium, and it starts going downhill. Even the loss of plant life. Plants can grow great, and then all of a sudden, boom, they stop. There's a lot of reasons why that happens, but plants are very dependent upon elements that go into your aquarium that need to get to the root system. They also are extremely dependent upon the bacteria growth that is in the substrate of which their root systems are established. When you cannot provide these elements readily available to the root systems of the plant, they finally exhaust everything and they finally just peter out, if you want to call it that. This explains a lot, doesn't it? When you use a plenum or when you use a slow-moving plenum, no matter what anybody says, it is moving elements from the water body or inside the main aquarium into your substrate. So it becomes readily available 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to the bacteria and to the root system of your plants. No easy way to get these elements to the root system or to your bacteria, and your bacteria count in your substrate is going to go down. Your plants are going to start starving to death because you are not giving them the essential elements that they need continuously. Okay, this explains why manufacturers then have made supplements. That's fine. But if you took your substrate and placed it directly on the bottom and you have no means or easy means to get what's in the aquarium into that substrate, you will have a system that will fail. The second thing of it is manufacturers said the substrate becomes tired and therefore we are going to make these little fertilizer pills that you can shove into your substrate. Now you understand why they do it. Because they realize the elements that are so vital to bacteria and so vital to plant life and animal life are getting used up. And they need to be replenished some way, somehow. This is how people say, I bought fluval stratum and after a few years it got tired and it didn't work anymore. It didn't work anymore because those essential elements were used up. And now you have to get those elements back into your substrate so the root hair that are on the plants can utilize those elements. You don't have to worry about those elements getting to plants that don't require the root systems to be buried. Only those plants that need to have the root systems buried in a substrate. This is the reason you use a slow-moving plenum or a plenum. Elements through electrical charge, through diffusion, or through convection are constantly moving in and out of the substrate, replenishing the substrate with these essential elements that are so badly needed for plant growth and bacteria growth. So I hope I have made that pretty clear. And of course, no matter what anybody says out there, this is the way it works. And essentially manufacturers know this. That's why they make root tabs, because they know things become exhausted. And they know when you throw that substrate at the bottom of your aquarium, it is going to get exhausted unless you somehow, some way, add those elements back in, those essential elements back into that substrate. And then they know if your food stuff that's available to bacteria and you're not growing the bacteria like you used to can't use those food stuff, you will have an imbalance in your aquarium. And essentially what happens when you get an imbalance in your aquarium? We all know. Bacteria is lessened. What takes over? The easiest form of life there is. Algae start taking over. All these algae start go berserko in an aquarium like that. Because what we found out, like in China, for example, when the system collapsed like that, the only thing that could really live in such a disaster system was algae. Algae of various sorts, and that's what limnologists look at. They look at algae, they look at the various sorts of algae, and they understand what is happening inside the ecosystem of which we are looking at. Try to understand it. It's no different than your aquarium. This explains to you why your aquarium starts collapsing after a few years or after a year or two. Those essential elements get depleted very, very, very quickly. Even if you put mud on the bottom of your aquarium with all the essential elements and trace elements in it, and eventually the bacteria is going to bloom in there. Eventually it's going to get used up. And some way, somehow, you got to get those essential elements back into your substrate. Iron being the most important. So I hope you've learned something from this video. If anything, you need to move elements into your substrate, and you need to keep those elements coming into that substrate on a continuous basis. The only way you can do it is first you have to have the chemical and biological pathways open to chemical and biological mediators. That is the only way you can do it. There is no other way of doing it. You have to keep them moving. You have to make them available to the bacteria. You have to keep them available to the plant roots. And it's not just plant roots. If you look at a plant root, it has little hair follicles on it. Those are what take up these elements and use them. Once this starts getting depleted, the plant starts suffering. This is the reason you make a plenum. Slow moving. Plants cannot take speedy water going through it at 900 miles an hour. They can't take it. They have to have time so their root hairs can do absorption. That takes time. So things have to move slowly. But you cannot hinder that movement. And hindering that movement means placing your substrate directly on the bottom of the aquarium. You hinder that movement. And the only way to have that movement is if you're using plants to keep that movement going. And if those plants get exhausted with the trace elements that are in the substrate, eventually the system will collapse. Now you better understand what happens and why it's happening and why you need a very slow convected movement, a diffusion of elements, convection, or you need an electrical charge to attract the positive ions out of the water and trap them and make them readily available to your plants and to the bacteria. We will get more into this as these videos continue. Thank you very much. This is Dr. Novak.